Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I know we have some people who are still logging on, but we're going to go ahead and get started to take care of kind of our introductions because we have a lot of ground we'd like to cover today. We're happy they're able to join us for our Leadership Learning webinar series, Increasing Your Value in a Data-Driven Organization. We've really gotten a lot of interest around this topic, and just in general, there's been a lot of buzz around kind of how people can ensure that they are effectively using data to make better business decisions. So regardless of your role, we want to help you increase your value by preparing you to be able to make better business decisions. So first, I want to just take care of a few housekeeping things before I introduce our faculty presenter. We will be making today's slides available to all of you. So after the webinar, sometime this afternoon, you should watch for an email, and in that email, there will be a link to the slides. So that's how you'll be able to get a copy of the slides. Also, I know we have a lot of thought-provoking information that Chris will be presenting today. So please feel free to chat in your questions as they occur to you. I will make sure that we get them addressed. We've reserved some time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, but also we'll be addressing some of the questions along the way. So go ahead and chat those in at any time, and we'll make sure that we address those. So with those items out of the way, I want to introduce today's presenter, Chris Keisler. Chris is one of our business leader faculty members here at Lake Forest Graduate School. He teaches in our data analytics course, as well as he facilitates sessions in our corporate learning and training division. Now, Chris has been on faculty since 2017. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and I'm going to let him provide a little bit more additional information about his professional experience. Welcome, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for everyone who took the time to join today. Carolyn sent some of the things that people have asked in advance. I'll hopefully work in some of those as we go through the conversation. But just real quick, a little bit about me. I've been working at the intersection of business and technology for about 25 years. A lot of that work has been in consulting, advising companies on their technology strategies and how data and digital play into that. I've served in senior leadership roles in technology firms as well as startups. But what I really want to make sure it comes through today, and again, if you're not hearing it, feel free to ask questions or follow up afterwards. But in the with them, what I'm hoping that everyone gets out of this is we as leaders are kind of at this point right now that a lot of things are happening. And I want to share with you the work I've done and the things that I've seen as individuals and organizations navigate this transition. So I'm hoping to some of the stories I share and some of my observations are meaningful and give you a starting point as you navigate your own journeys in becoming data-driven. So what we're going to talk about today is just like we identified up front. We're talking about increasing your value in a data-driven organization. Now, some of these things I call out because I think they're really important to help us understand from a context perspective. But the revolution is now, right? It's happening right in front of us before our very eyes, if you will. Companies are being built and rebuilt based upon data. There's lots of studies out there anecdotally and whatnot to talk about this. I mean, just think about an example that any time Amazon, even Ingalls, that they're going to move into a new industry overnight, shares in the companies who are incumbent there start to fall, right? It's happening right now because of compute power and storage capacity costs decrease, and companies that make investments in these platforms realize a 3% growth in productivity. There's growth in the data sources and the signals that are out there for organizations to take advantage of. Just think, for example, your retail experience, how there's probably now a mobile app that's involved, and when you go into the store, you're getting prompted along the way. I mean, there's more signals and opportunity to create signals that organizations are either building in or taking advantage of. The skills and the tools are coming in very rapidly. I mean, people are coming out of undergraduate and graduate programs with backgrounds in this. And the tools on our desktops are changing, right? A lot of organizations are rolling out business intelligence and reporting tools and upping the stakes. This next one down, I kind of call it because I think it's an important one to think about. GE cited in part of their case of why they were building into digital and why they're developing Predix is really the notion that there's not a lot of efficiencies left to be gained through the more traditional means of business process optimization and Six Sigma and hiring a bunch of consultants. And instead, data-driven companies realize an increase of 4 to 6% in productivity when they make these kinds of investments. A lot of hype, right? Everyone's heard about AI and Watson and drawing a lot of attention there. And then the things that we're trying to do and our companies are trying to do, like creating better customer experiences, better employee experiences, really rely on data and the architectures that we built. Things like chatbots and personalization and recommendation engines require these capabilities. And then lastly, our boards and our shareholders are expecting our companies to be using data in different ways. Right? And, and it's been happening for a long time. As we kind of think through the different kinds of industrial revolutions that, that's been taking place, really the third industrial revolution is kind of the stepping off point for this, where personal computing and communications started becoming more prolific, enterprise software and infrastructure became a big thing, and now all these things we're talking about now are being built upon those years of investments, where technologies are being configured in different ways to do things like artificial intelligence, like blockchain, like Internet of Things. So it's happening right now. So how are companies coping, right? There's a lot of thoughts out there, a lot of points of views out there. I like a study that Gartner did a while ago, and I asked this in some of my client meetings just from a straw poll perspective, but they asked CIOs and people who owned technology budgets what % of their resources were going into some different categories. And basically their survey said about 70% of technology spend is going into running the business. And I would think of that of things like your infrastructure, your ERP systems, and so forth. They asked how much of resources were allocated to growing the business, and this is about 20%. So I would categorize things like Salesforce automation and manufacturing systems reflecting some of this. And then they asked how much is actually going into transforming the business. And about 10% of resources are being allocated to transforming the business. When I've done this kind of as a straw poll, put your hand up in the air type of conversation, I even hear some technology executives talk about this as even single-digit percentages of what the allocation looks like. So, but what I would argue is that spend on transforming the business is really where this fourth industrial revolution is taking place. But while that's happening on the inside, there's things happening outside. Gartner in the same study asked, the CIOs, as a percentage of revenue, what were these technology spends like overall? And they said about 2.5% of revenue is going into technology. So if you take that 10%, that's going into transforming the business, here's a way that I think about it, right? You take Netflix in 1997, got started with a seed of $1.9 million. Blockbuster's revenue was about $3.5 billion. So back of an envelope, you might say they were spending about $8 to $9 million on transforming the business. Just goes to show you how companies with very little spend can be disruptive to incumbents. Another thing about Airbnb, right? In 2009, it got started for $620,000 in seed capital. Starwood's revenue, right? Starwood now since gone, now acquired by Marriott because the shareholders thought there wasn't much value left and wanted to release the capital. Could have been spending about $11 to $12 million on some of these innovation projects. But the whole notion that I want to help everyone understand in this conversation is there's all this disruption that's happening outside of our four walls, and these things we're doing on the fringes are really important. Now, some things that make this really hard is that data in our organizations has been typically a byproduct of the transactional systems. It's been used in hindsight. It's usually very structured in terms of the applications that create it or the business functions that use it. And getting value requires significant capital. Meanwhile, the disruptors on the outside, they're built on data, right? Their business models, their products and services from the very beginning are designed around data. Their infrastructure and their architecture is meant to be fluid and very, very flexible to do different things. And, the last point to call out here is when they make changes to their infrastructure, their technologies, it doesn't require the same degree of capital investment. So they have some flexibility that they're exerting in these situations. So let's get back to what being data-driven means, right? Basically, being data-driven means using data and information to make decisions and measure results. It's getting past this perception of how we've always done things, I know it when I see it, and really using facts and measurable observations. Data-driven is not, and I have these conversations with clients, it's not making everybody into a data scientist. It's not outsourcing and sending your data projects to a third party or locking your data scientists in a room and having them do something interesting. It's not a one-and-done event or a milestone event. For example, when you hire a chief data officer, it does not mean you're data-driven. And it's not perfect or irrefutable, right? Data is messy, right? It comes from transactions and processes that do different things and create different signals. But it provides a means for us to understand what's going on in our businesses. So being data-driven, it's a journey, right? We're using data as a resource to make decisions, to engage stakeholders, to innovate, and deliver results. So here's some of the traits of successful organizations that have gone through this process. I think this first one's really important. I think it plays into what a lot of us have to think about in our roles. Executives in data-driven organizations are curious and they're creative, right? They're thinking about the problem from a number of different, they're trying to figure out, there are ways to break it down into smaller pieces or to look at it from different stakeholders' points of views. Data is democratized, right? It's made available to everyone in the organization. It's not locked into silos. So if someone in supply chain wants to see sales data, it's available for them to explore it. There's a common language associated with data. Gartner calls this data literacy, but it's really a way of talking about our business in terms of data. One way to think about this, when Gartner has a podcast on it, but I think one of the interesting takeaways around data literacy is they talk about people who are sports fanatics. And they talk about the fact that they can cite statistics about their favorite player or their favorite teams, the on-base percentages, the ERA, the batting averages, whatever that data is associated to that sport. That's a form of data literacy, right? It's using numbers to explain what goes on, and even in our own organizations, there's opportunity to do that. They're innovative based upon data, right? They start small, then they scale. They go after a problem that they can measure and understand, and then they take that insight and apply it in different ways, or take that approach and share with different stakeholders. The cultures are built around empowerment and learning. The last one I want to call out, which I think is really important, is these organizations fail fast. Now, I know fail fast causes a lot of eye rolls, and I get it, because it's this whole thing that there's these badges of honors of Silicon Valley tech startups that fail, but that's not what fail fast means. Fail fast means is that we learn quickly by the things that aren't working. So we're not taking months or years, we're actually taking days and weeks, and we're getting early signals of what that strategy is or what that observation is, and pivoting on it and applying that insight. But this isn't easy, right? We're third week into the football season right now, and there's articles coming out there how coaches are blowing it on fourth down. And there's ample data out there that tells a coach how they should manage this situation in the game. So a question I'll put out to you in this conversation today, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, but it's 4th and 2, you're on the opponent's 5-yard line. Do you go for it, right? There's data that has a lot of different ways to break down that problem, and coaches do and don't use that data. So why is it so hard? Well, let's look internally for a second, right? Why is this so hard? The thing I take away from this slide here, and I think it's really important for all of us participating today, is the biggest challenge that comes from being data-driven is the people dimension, right? It's not process, it's not technology, it's people, right? This comes from a survey by a company called New Vantage. Tom Davenport is one of the authors of the survey, and he writes and talks a lot about this. But I think it's really telling and something for us to reflect on is the people dimension and how organizations may not be able to achieve becoming data-driven. And there's some details he shares in terms of cultural resistance and understanding data as an asset and the flexibility in our organizations to make this transition. But there's also places, too, where people simply don't trust the data, which begs a different kind of question. But we as leaders and executives and are being charged with helping drive our organizations have to break that down. So for the next 45, 30 minutes or so, I'm going to give you 4 things to think about, and we're going to spend some time on these topics. I want you to think about what your role is as a leader in managing your teams through this data-driven transformation. Think about the expectations of you and of others that are tied to this transition. We're going to talk about the blind spots we may have that preclude us from being successful. And then we'll spend some time on kind of what your future looks like. And then hopefully there's some questions that come through there that we can play through a little bit. So let's get into it. Your role as a leader. So data-driven leadership starts with seeing your business through the lens of data. And what that really means is trying to understand your business processes, your customer interactions, things happening in your supply chain through the data that's available. I'm going to share a client study of mine, and it kind of helps contextualize this. So in this case here, this client actually is in the medical device space. They have a wearable that actually monitors glucose levels, and that wearable is tied to a mobile app that allows patients to upload their glucose levels that they can share with their physicians. And in this case here, this business leader wanted to understand churn through the lens of data, right? So not what he thinks happens, not what he thinks is going on, but actually look at the data, look how it reflects it. So the work for our team was to define churn through the data, to try to figure out how we can measure it, to identify the drivers behind it, and then be able to predict and reduce when churn would take place. So the first thing as a business leader is setting the context. So in this case here, how do you measure churn? Well, one definition of churn is a sales definition, right, which is basically what you expect from an ordering pattern, right? So, for example, in this case here, when they placed their last order, what they ordered, and when they're expected to replenish that. So there's a sales definition of churn. There could be a channel definition of churn. So in pharma and med device companies, very rarely does someone actually buy directly from the manufacturer. They typically go through a distributor or a retail model. In this case here, though, they actually had some direct sales. So do you measure churn by moving to the channels, or can you understand when they've left the channel altogether, or when they've left, when they stopped using the device? Or do you measure churn from a behavioral definition? So again, we're talking about a wearable, so we know when people are wearing it and when they're sending data back. But there's people who may do different things with the device. They may wear it, they may take breaks, like for vacations or holidays. So that all of these things actually play into the context, and this is where our role as business leaders really comes through, is helping to frame the context and helping to understand and provide a definition. The other thing about leadership from a data perspective, and is we have to think about what data is available and how do we actually measure and use and apply it to the hypotheses that we have. So in this case here, right, we saw a moment ago that there's some direct sales. So the most ideal situation is when someone buys directly and they're using the technology in a way they're getting real-time updates. As we move away from that upper left box, we get less fidelity, right? We have less insights. So, what can we measure and what can we observe? As we look at the data itself and what data is available, some of this data is very readily available. For example, support calls. But data that's not available are detailed app usage things. For example, where the app is being used, how many times the app is being logged into. We don't have those details, which may define what we can and can't measure or identify. And in the case here as well, there's scenarios where we actually can link patients to what their out-of-pocket costs are. We actually link patients to their device and their mobile app, and we had a hypothesis that cost was a factor. So when we look at all the people that we can measure and understand and bring the data together to, we were about 4,800 patients we could actually identify and monitor in the data of a few 100,000 patients. So as a business leader, the discussion comes down to, is 4,800 enough to work with to understand churn? And in the case here, I give this executive a lot of credit, because they said, what I learned from the 4,800, I can apply to some other segments that I may not be able to observe in the data. So we got the green light to proceed with the study. But again, the executive's role, the business leader's role plays into understanding what the factors are of churn that we can observe and monitor in the data. And what it came down to is we actually didn't really get strong indicators of churn. But what we were able to understand through the data is breaks. And a break is when somebody stops using the device for a period of time. So we're able to observe and monitor breaks, and then we could actually predict someone's likelihood of returning from a break. So what that did is it allowed our executive and his team to actually put into practice ways of intervening and engaging with patients who are using the device who are taking extended breaks, and try to create mechanisms to bring them back sooner from those breaks. So your role as a leader, right? Your role as a leader in data-driven, becoming data-driven, is lead by example, right? There's an opportunity to think about how you ask questions and ask questions differently, right? Seek to understand your business through the data. What does it tell you? Your role is bringing context, right? You as a business leader can connect the strategy and the operations and the execution of how the business is actually being done and provide that context to people who are working with the data. You can set the managed scope. So you look at the example we just talked about a moment ago, and we were basically saying, we can't do churn because there's a lot of factors that go into it. We probably could have spent months, if not years, trying to model churn. So the business leader basically helped us focus in that scope is going to be on people who are taking breaks. So we're able to get some of the problem solved and respond appropriately. And then you put those things into practice. So again, in the case here, what they did is they actually put that metric. They have a metric now that they actually have as part of Salesforce. So when someone is engaging with a customer service rep to place an order or calling in with a question on their device or technology, they actually can see their break patterns and try to figure out if there's other kind of intervention that they want to do. All right. Carol, are there any questions yet?
Well, we had one question where when you mentioned kind of the confidence piece, where people are looking for advice on how to, without getting into the weeds, help others have confidence in their data. So when they're making, trying to make decisions or put forth decisions, how can they get others to kind of come along and understand where that data is coming from and have confidence in it?
Yeah, we're going to cover some other slides in a bit that will go through some of that, but my first response is sometimes it's starting small and proving it out, and it's demonstrating. And we'll go through some examples of that question sufficiently in the slides. We'll make some time at the end for it.
Okay.
Let's get into expectations, right? There's a lot of expectations as our organizations are going through this transition. So, basically expectations is delivering results. And as you break down the different kinds of expectations that go into these transformations, I look at them in terms of the strategic ones, right? They're typically those that are going to be, we're going to transform our industry, we're going to get new customers. There's the operational expectations, right? Using data to make decisions is an example. And then there's the practical ones, which are how we're going to work in these new models. Again, the same Davenport survey called out that some of the expectations associated with making better decisions and improving customer service were at the top of the list. So what does that mean? Well, as leaders, we play a role in managing and delivering on those expectations. So the question I put to all of us to think about is, what is it that we can control in those expectations and helping our organizations become data-driven? The first one is really kind of unpacking what your team actually is going to contribute to those expectations, really getting around what parts of it you own. Determining what kind of help you need, what kind of internal partnerships or tools or resources are you going to need to deliver on those expectations. Putting the process together of how you're going to deliver on those expectations. And then lastly, how you're going to communicate the results to your progress overall. So we actually can take a lot of ownership of leaning in and figuring out what part of what's being signed up for we can take ownership of, and that will be a mechanism to help our organizations move forward in becoming data-driven. So let's talk about building teams. I get this question a lot, and Carolyn and Neil and I talked a lot before getting ready today, so I think it's important to break this down. And Gartner does a lot of work on this, so you'll find me citing them a lot because I think they have a lot of good tools and insights that you'd find helpful on your own offline. But basically, it's about blended teams, right? No one stakeholder or constituent brings the entire picture to the table. So from a business perspective, what we're really talking about here is bringing the business situation, the context, the requirements, how things are being done, any of our internal processes and policies. That's the business context we bring. From an IT perspective, they're typically associated with the technical infrastructure and resources that are available. So the architecture, the processing, the storage, that's going to be essential because you have to know where the data is and how it's structured and what creates the data. And then lastly, it's the data science piece, which is a lot of times kind of seen as this magic dust that's sprinkled on it. But that's a discrete set of skills as well, right? I mean, data scientists typically bring ways to categorize and understand the problem. So are we talking about a categorization problem or a regression problem? What are some of the analytical methods that are available to us? What does the data show us? So what we're really talking about here is the first step of meeting these expectations is recognizing our teams need to look and operate differently, but you need different kinds of expertise at the table to make this real. The other part about meeting these expectations is recognizing our ways of work are going to have to evolve. There's a lot of language out there in terms of things like Agile and Lean and Six Sigma and Kanban, and there's even almost religious zealots who would advocate for one over the other. What I would actually say to simplify it is really when we talk about these teams or these structures, they're really different ways of working. Right, the teams are, in an ideal setting are allowed to be self-organizing, and they organize based upon principles and values and desired outcomes. They have autonomy and even some authority to think about the solution and put it into practice. They have shared goals and results. They work in short cycles, and this is important because a lot of organizations, when they get data science teams together, the idea is that we're going to solve these interesting problems and we're going to look at them from a lot of different ways. But if you allow these groups to run in perpetuity without focus and goals and a clear measurable outcome and extracting value out of that work, it's kind of a wasted pursuit. So short cycles, and sometimes these are called sprints, but we're talking about really getting to answers and insights in a matter of days and weeks and putting those into practice. So it's a very different way of working. So what does this look like? Well, CRISP-DM is kind of a standard framework that's applied to how analytical teams are working together and how data mining takes place. But to walk through it, right, there's the notion we start with the business understanding, right? So this is where we have people who bring the context, the requirements, the objectives, the expectations, the questions that we have, and they also bring kind of the plan and how we're going to communicate the progress and put this into practice. There's people who bring the data understanding, right, which is really understanding how the data reflects the situation. You know, what can we understand from a context perspective? Do we understand how correlate or how different trends are identified in the data? And then what happens is you have that business understanding and you have that data understanding. There has to be some sort of negotiation, right? I had this question, well, the data says this. Is it worth pursuing or not, right? And there's that back and forth, and then there's potential refining of how we proceed. But once we kind of have an alignment between the business question and how the data reflects that question, we then have work that goes into preparing and modeling, evaluating that data, right? This is the work that goes into getting the data ready and prepared and doing the analytical techniques and getting an insight or an answer out and discussing how we're treating certain variables and what it reflects and how we could actually apply a model or an insight in practice. But again, there's a negotiation back to the business understanding. Can we do something meaningful with that regression model about customer retention? Does that classification actually mean something as an employee group that we want to address with different benefits? You have to go through some negotiation there. And once you negotiate that and you come to a consensus that you're heading down the right path, you deploy it. You put that insight into practice. So if it's a model you're going to use for customer segmentation, if it's a metric you're going to use, you put that into practice, and then you monitor and observe it. And again, you bring the business understanding of are you getting progress or results in the desired direction. So next, let's get into some of the blind spots that exist. And we all have them, right? When we get into this whole notion of becoming data-driven, there's a lot of blind spots. And as leaders, we need to be conscious of them. Here's a list of some blind spots that I've commonly seen. I mean, I don't think the list is exhaustive, but if we kind of think through blind spots that we have, our organizations have, a lot of them are around data. The data itself, is it of the right quality, the right completeness, and are we familiar enough with it to use it to apply to the problem we're going after? Bias is a big blind spot, right? We have preconceived notions. We're expecting to see certain things in the data. If we get an outcome, we may provide overfit because it's something we desire to see and we really want to make this work. A lot of insecurity comes through in our biases, right? So, for example, if I get a result back and I don't like it, am I at risk? There's skills that contribute to our blind spots. We talked about data literacy earlier, but there's technical proficiency and analytical curiosity. So what is it that we need to do to address, to close that gap in skills? There's internal processes that create a lot of bias. So a classic example here is with consumer data, there might be internal rules that decide what you can and can't do with that data. So you may have a really interesting idea or problem you want to solve about how to engage your customers differently, but you may not be able to because there's policies in place that preclude you from doing it. There's bias associated to adoption. So I think this kind of reflects the question we had earlier, is do we actually have the resources, the tools, the commitment from leadership to put this into practice or not? And being aware of that might define how you go about your approach. There's biases that are attributed to teams, right? So do we have the right team members brought together? I mean, if you have kind of a blank slate or an aspirational state, people who put together very successful teams around data, and you hear this from a lot of chief data officers, they want such diverse skills to include people from regulatory. They want graphic designers and psychologists. They want data scientists. They want people outside of industry that bring a whole different set of models and tools, right? So diversity can be reflected in that, and that might be some ways to address some of that teaming bias. Culture is a huge bias or a huge blind spot, and I think this reflects some of the question as well. What is it we have to put in place in order to address some of the resistance we're going to encounter? And then lastly, but not unimportant, is technology, right? Do we have blind spots associated to our technology? Do we have the storage, the processing, the compute things we need? Do we have the analytical tools we need? Do we have all these things in place to go through and acquire and achieve these aspirational statements? So let's kind of talk about an example and how this works. And sometimes we do a really good job of telegraphing our bias in simply how we approach the problem. What I want to do here is lay out for you another client of mine in the pharmaceutical space. And as a little bit of background, the drug that they use actually it requires a pretty complicated process of approvals and sign-offs and making sure that certain decisions made along the way to make sure this drug is being used in an appropriate way. And oftentimes what happens is this company helps the physician navigate the reimbursement process to make sure that it gets covered. But again, I want to talk about how sometimes we telegraph our blind spots, but how we think about the problem. So in one approach, the client approaches this problem from trying to understand which health plans are denying reimbursement. So again, which ones aren't going to pay the patients and the physician's claims. Another approach is why are claims for reimbursement being denied? And again, why I use these approaches to telegraph blind spots is these two respective approaches will net very different results. So it's being clear and being conscious of what you're trying to accomplish. So as an example, and this was actually very real to the client, when senior executives are trying to understand which plans were denying reimbursement, they got lists of health plans, they got breakdowns by period, they got some segmentation around the drug, and the coding was being done, some breakdown around geography. So they got the actual answer to the question they had asked for. As opposed to where we help the client evolve to is, why are we having claims be denied? Is there a seasonal basis? So for example, are some claims denied certain times of the year or not? Are there behaviors associated to what the physician is doing or what the patient is doing? Do things like cost play a factor in reimbursement? But simply by the way you think about the question and break it down may identify blind spots, and it actually gives you an opportunity to think about this in a way of actually, am I going to get a meaningful result that I can put into practice? The way to think about this is there's different types of analytics that can be done. And I wouldn't promote these as one being better than another. Each one is done slightly differently, and it gets you to a different endpoint. So there's obviously a set of analytics you need to do that are descriptive to try to understand what happened, right? And this is more the hindsight look of things. There's a set of analytics you're going to want to do to understand why did it happen, which is kind of where we reflect in that second scenario there, and that's in the diagnostic space. Then you want to get into predictive, right? You may need to predict when it will happen. What are the factors that lead to it happening so I can predict when certain events line themselves up again, there's a likelihood of it happening or not happening. And then the last one, and often the most complicated one, is how can we make it happen? So what things do we need to put into place to ensure that a certain event will happen? And the takeaway for us here is really to think about how we ask the question may impose or infer certain blind spots. And again, all of these questions are important. One is not necessarily better than the other, but thinking about how you ask the question may predetermine the answer that you get. So bringing this piece together here, let's acknowledge that we have blind spots, right? And the first thing is knowing how you ask influences the answer you get. Another way to think about our blind spots is making sure we bring teams together that bring diverse subject matter expertise and skills. Being aware of preconceived notions, right? I mean, I think back to this notion of I know it when I'll see it. I think back to when I first started my job years and years ago. I used to be the guy that would grab the stack of prints off of the printer. If you guys remember green bar paper, right? The white paper, I'd take it to the manager's desk and she would open it. She'd have a ruler and she'd go looking across for certain things and she'd circle things that she wanted people to look at. And I'd ask her, how do you know that that's the account you want to follow up on? And she says, I know when I see it. When these numbers do this, I know it. So there's preconceived notions, and the question is that the right behavior or pattern? Then the next notion here about knowing your blind spots and managing your blind spots is getting comfortable with the language of data and the tools and methods that are being used and deployed by people like data scientists. And what I would put here is one of the roles I had was with an organization called Silicon Valley Data Science, and I led our healthcare practice. And there was times I would just sit with the data scientists and watch how they were doing their process. And by looking over their shoulders and seeing them work with a data set about patients and device usage or reimbursement, I'd see the analyses they were doing, and I'd ask questions about, like, why did you do it that way, and what does that mean? And they would ask questions back to me, does this make sense because this is what the data is showing? But simply sitting with these individuals, I mean, I would not say I'm a data scientist, but sitting with these individuals, I understood their thought process, and I understood the language that they use. So then when an analysis was complete, I could understand and articulate and convey it to others. So there's a lot of value in that exercise. So let's get into what your future looks like when we arrive at this end state. Some of the attributes of companies and individuals in organizations that have kind of evolved, and we would call them potentially even revolutionaries, is they really start the process with having a product development mindset. There's a term very popular in tech circles, a role that's very popular hiring their data product owners and data product managers. And that's really important because people are thinking about the data and the algorithms and the data sets they use as product, and they're using it to design processes and create experiences and new offerings, and data is tightly linked to that. Organizations that are kind of evolved all the way through, blend products and services to create stickiness. I mean, we see this in our everyday lives, right? We have devices in our home that are connected to our phones or connected to an Alexa that are connected to our computers, and we're interacting with all of these things, right? And it creates stickiness, and that's driven by data. Organizations that have done this move and disrupt quickly. And what's important here is, and I think this goes back to the question a little bit, is we're not talking about large transformations. I would argue that those things are really hard and complicated to do and miss the target. Instead, we're talking about is small, discrete, measurable progress forward. So, for example, A/B testing features on a new website, and taking and translating those things back and forth, and using the insight from one to infer the other, and iterating and evolving a website to be more customer friendly. The other thing these organizations do is they design up front very deliberately for sharing and for reuse. So what they're doing from the very beginning is they're creating architectures, tools, data sets, models that might work to solve my problem, but might help a near neighbor problem as well, and they're communicating those results out, and they're building their organizations and their architectures based upon that. So what I would say is start thinking about your future self, and we talked about some of these themes already, but I would say as leaders who are part of this data-driven transformation, some of the ways I think about it is the first one, just start being curious, right? Start asking questions about your business through the lens of data. Look at it from different directions. Seek partners who can help you understand the data. If you don't have the skills in your team or even yourself, find people in your organization that can help you understand the data and how it matches to the business. The next notion of future self that I would put is a whole notion of being honest. And what we're really talking about here, and what I'm suggesting here is understand what your data does and does not convey. I mean, there's times that people want to find an event in data, and they can really find it if they try hard enough, but it may not be reality. So being honest about what that data does and doesn't articulate. And also being honest also means going beyond your biases and presumptions, right? Opening yourself up to what's possible, what's being articulated in fact. And then the last notion here I put about your future self, it's someone who's collaborative, right? You have a lot of expertise and knowledge of what happens in your function, in your organization, in your company. Share that knowledge with people who are trying to solve the problem through the lens of data. Help bring together diverse teams that think about these problems, and challenge each other to be expeditious. And the reason why I emphasize the word expeditious here is I think expediency is important because we have to quickly get to value and get to results. We can't take forever to solve these problems, and data is moving quickly, and the sooner you get a signal from the data, you can take action on it, and we can challenge each other to think about how we can arrive at those insights more quickly. So at the onset here, all right, I asked you to think about 4 different dimensions, and we went through this. And what we're really talking about here is leading by example, right? It's about the way we ask questions. It's about bringing context. It's about managing scope and putting our observations into practice. From an expectations perspective, recognize the pieces that we can take control of and what we can contribute in helping fulfill our organization's expectations of how we're becoming data-driven. From a blind spots perspective, recognize it's how we ask questions, but it's also getting familiarity with the tools and the methods and the language of data and analytics so we can actually start to bring more insight. And then lastly, think about what's going to take to become your future self, right? By becoming curious, by being honest and think about the opportunity, but being realistic and pragmatic, and being collaborative, how we share our expertise and how we bring our teams together in order to make this happen. So I asked the question at the beginning, and I want to come back to it. So it's 4th and 2 on the 5-yard line. Do you go for it? Right, well, there's some different points of view. So Yam and Lopez did some work for the NFL a few years ago, and they basically said the average team could have 0.4 win per year by being more aggressive. Romer's an academic and probably just works in financial modeling, but spent some time on this and basically said a team on 4th and goal and 5 yards are better off going for the end zone on average. And then Burke is a blogger and an analyst in his own right, did his own modeling and basically suggested that going in this situation makes a ton of sense. And yet, it doesn't always happen, right? Here's a quote from Bill Cowher, who was the Steelers head coach. And I think that this is what we encounter in our organizations, right? Even with all the data and all the algorithms, and knowing what the percentage are and the likelihood is, it doesn't mean we always do it right. And I like the last part of the quote here that really starts it, because that one time it doesn't work could cost your team a game, and that's the thing that head coach has to live with, not the professor. So that means bringing business context and making sure all these things go together. So do you go for it 4th and 2? I mean, and analytically you'd suggest yes, but there's other factors we don't know, right? We don't know what's left on the clock. We don't know what the score is. We don't know what the momentum of the game is. We don't know what the injuries are. So there's a lot of factors we don't know. So as business leaders, you have the same challenge to think through those factors you don't know, and you can put them into practice. Let me kind of start to bring it to a close, and I want to get some of the questions that are coming through. Conversation today, I referenced several pieces of information directly or indirectly. Here are some books that I often reference when I talk about these things. Some of them are available through Lake Forest. Others are ones I've just kind of come across over the years. There's also conferences on these topics, some that are industry specific, some that are domain specific. So, for example, my background is healthcare. HIMSS always, has a lot of topics that talk about data in different ways. Conferences like Strata, TDWI, spend a lot of time talking about this. There's lots of websites out there you can start to refer to. You heard me refer to Gartner several times. CIO is another good one as well that has resources for you. And there's all kinds of great online resources as well. Khan Academy has a lot of good ways as a primer, a lot of good online courses and resources that you can even take as lightweight kind of ways to start to get yourself comfortable with some of these concepts. But with that, I open up to any questions that people may have. Carolyn, do we have any questions coming through? I'm not sure if I answered the first question, so let me make sure I got that and some of the others.
So we have a question. People that work with data analysts and engineers, and they pull their own data every day, but what they find sometimes is the numbers are just not reliable or the data is incorrect. And what's the best way to manage this?
Well, I mean,
so it's unreliable data, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, right? So I think the first question comes down to understanding why the data is unreliable. Is the data unreliable because the system isn't capturing the data the right way? Is it unreliable because of what people are keying in? Is it unreliable because of data quality issues? So the first question on reliability, we even talked about in the slide up front of why people don't trust it. We have to understand why it's unreliable, because the first thing you try to understand is how data reflects the business process or the business events. So what I might do is I might try to reframe the problem in terms of what I can do with the data. So I may not be able to solve everything, but is there a point where I have a high degree of confidence in some of the data? And we can look back to the example we used for churn. We actually were able to have a high degree of confidence in their saying patients who took breaks of their devices. So I think there's, again, let me summarize, right? Break it down by what can you do with the data, right? Because you can't obviously solve everything because of a reliability issue. Understanding why it's unreliable and other ways to improve the reliability of it. And you may just come to the conclusion that that specific study you're trying to do just may not be feasible. And just accepting that as a fact. So you may need to institute some other initiative to get a higher quality data to work with.
So along those same lines, somebody was asking the question about how do they basically get their company to understand the need for data because they're not maybe collecting the right kind of data or enough data to make these decisions. So how can they make that important to their organization?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of the mindset, can control the things that you can, right? And it depends where you're on the organization. If you can create a compelling enough argument to say you need to do things differently. And in an ideal scenario, right, you can make the case that you need to instrument the company in a certain way. So, for example, is it putting sensors on a manufacturing line? Is it putting different things on the website in a mobile app to pick up those signals? So if you have the clout and the means to do it, that would be how I'd recommend going about it. If you don't, right, or you're trying to prove out a case, the best examples I've seen are ones where you start small, and you have to, part of starting small is being able to identify a business event in the data that happens through a repeated set of patterns, understand why that event takes place, and then showing how you can start to institute even small changes to drive attention towards it. So as an example, a client of mine was trying to convince their organization to become data-driven, and they created a center of excellence, which was really bringing together the tools and skills, but that center of excellence was a resource to the entire organization. So they started simple, right? From a forecasting and planning perspective, they just started doing Monte Carlo analyses on what future scenarios might look like. This gets people to start to think about
We have another question. When you were talking about the different levels of analytics, someone's wanting to know, do you have to master each level of analytics or can you skip ahead? For instance, do you need, I lost my place here, do you need to do descriptive before you do prescriptive?
I would not, it's interesting. I was doing some reading on that slide a while ago for a different question, but you know, the author of that slide, because that came from Gartner, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, his name is Doug Laney. I would not look at that slide as a maturity model. What I would look at that slide is recognizing there's different kinds of analytics for different kinds of questions. So I would suggest that probably most organizations are probably pretty good at the descriptive, and even at the earlier stages, what happened and why did it happen. When you go up there, there's different levels of complexity in terms of the skills that are needed, in terms of the analytical tools that are needed. But you may not need to be at that level of complexity for all questions you're trying to solve for. You just might try to understand, why did an event happen? If you see it happen repeatedly, then you may want to go understand it more, get more predictive about it, or even prescriptive about it. But I would say that I would not look at it as a continue. You're focusing on those boxes for different reasons and different ways you're going to apply that insight.
Another question around data as far as protecting your data, because oftentimes sales data and things like that are in the public eye. So how do you protect it, or what's the best way to protect it from some of your competitors?
Well, I mean, this comes down to how your organization itself is architected and engineered for data security. You know, I mean, I don't know of any organization that puts their data out into the public domain unless they have to for a regulatory reason, or unless they're doing it for you know, negotiation or for sales purposes, right? Like making data available with a vendor when you're trying to figure out contracting for supply chains. So I'd say the first piece is you know, your organization, you know, obviously has to recognize that data is an asset. It should be treated as a highly treasured asset, so it should be contained in your four walls. But with that said, it shouldn't be locked in a vault that nobody can have access to. I mean, there are maybe compelling use cases from other parts of the enterprise that might find value in the sales data, might find value in the website, the web traffic data, might find value in an employee satisfaction survey, if you will. So internally, data should be available. Obviously, externally, you don't turn on that spigot unless there's a compelling use case that's behind making data available to the market.
Okay, I have a lot of other questions here. Let's see. What kind of tools do you see? What kind of tools do you see collecting data in the future? People now try to avoid using devices which can expose their privacy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really loaded question. It's not loaded because it drives me because there's a lot of things that are packed in there. So part of it is, yes, consumers are very concerned about their privacy. I was recently doing some work with a health system, and they were going to create a center for genomic health. And very similar, right? They need to create a compelling value proposition to the community to put their DNA into this program that they're offering. I would borrow from them, and I think their logic is sound up front. Be honest with people up front why you're collecting that data and how you're going to use it. I think where people have gotten in trouble is when you have the volumes of pages that Facebook or any of these other companies have out there, that it takes an attorney to go through and try to figure out how your data is going to be used, creates a lot of uncertainty and skepticism. But if you're upfront about what you're going to do with that data and how you're going to use it, and even to the point what you're not going to do with it, I think that candor and transparency goes a long way with people being willing to download an app or fill out a profile on a website. That'd be the first way I'd crack that nut. And I think trust and value that's delivered through doing that goes a long way. Then help you understand why you're asking for that information up front. But the other part too is be clear why you're asking for that information, and in many cases, don't ask for information you're not going to use, right? So, for example, if you don't need somebody's social security number, don't ask for it, right? If you need to create a unique identifier for that person, then find another way to do it.
We have a question from one of your former class members that had your class, loved it, involved in a project right now using what he learned, but he wants to know, how do you confront or direct stakeholders and contributors that are not asking the right questions or answering the right questions in choosing their data sets?
I mean, I think it goes back to leading by example, and I think this falls more into the kind of the traditional leadership models of how we encourage and motivate people and challenge them to think differently. And I think if someone were asking questions, so if you go back to the example we put in here about 2 ways of asking the question about reimbursement, sometimes you can say, what is it you're trying to understand? What hypothesis do you have? What do you believe to be true? How do you think that would be represented in the data? I think there's a healthy way to kind of guide people through a thought process to help them understand the question they're asking and the answer they're going to get and how they're going to use that answer.
Okay. Also, what attention has metadata gotten from companies in your experience? Is there more of a focal point now than in the past, and to what extent?
Yeah, there's a lot of attention being given to metadata nowadays. I mean, you have, if you look at kind of the enterprise data management tools, data catalogs, data lineage, logging files, master data management, all these things are spinning out metadata arguments, and they're playing more and more in a role. And on one hand, they're important because they're a way for people to understand the data, even start to do some early hypotheses testing against the data before you actually get deep into the data sets themselves, because sometimes they're very complicated, or there's internal rules that preclude people from getting access to them. So metadata is playing a bigger role. There's a lot of disciplines that are exposing what you can do with metadata. And I think it's going to continue to grow because there's a certain point in time that you can't, while storing this data and moving this data around is going to become relatively inexpensive, there's still cost that goes into processing and analyzing and putting technology and eyes behind it. So I think metadata is going to be a way a lot of people start to accelerate some other studies.
Okay, let's do like one more question, because I know we told people we'd be off so they can get to their meeting around 1. But part of the issue with data is being able to ask the right kind of critical business questions. So how do you teach the skill that you're asking the right critical business questions to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you teach a skill? It's a skill of inquiry. And I would say the best teachers of the skill for me, I mean, I'll be honest, there's a point in time I very much kind of I'll go back to the snare we put there between the two options. The way I used to ask the question looked very much like what we saw on the left side of that slide. Now I've evolved to the right side of that slide, and here's my own process. Let me put that in front of you as a starting point. It's actually working with people who actually understand the analytical process. Data scientists themselves are oftentimes coming from disciplines in the sciences, right? I mean, they've worked large data sets. So, for example, my last company, Silicon Valley Data Science, a lot of the data scientists we hired came from physics and psychology and chemistry and sociology, so in domains that they were very comfortable working with large sets of data. And what they had to learn is they actually had to learn the scientific process of having hypotheses and testing hypotheses and iterating and bringing results. And in working with individuals like that, it became apparent to me how you ask the question very much drives the kind of answer that you get. So I would say, think about that process that those individuals go through of how they actually try to understand. And it's highly nuanced. I get that. It's very nuanced. But if you start to understand the way people who are working with the data think about the question, you then start to think about how to ask questions in a more curious or exploratory way. So if I go back to the other side of that coin there, we talked about the reimbursement topic as an example. When we were working with the executive who ran that team, and her team was producing those reports for the senior management team of saying, here's a list of all the payers that didn't reimburse, what she basically came to say was she had to learn to coach those executives, what question that you're trying to ask? What is it you really want to know? And that's when you start delving into the whole notion of, I want to understand why people aren't paying the claims, why payers are taking a certain kind of pattern. Are physicians doing something that we need to intervene on because maybe we need to train or do something different to make it that they know how to write the scripts a certain way? So it became a mechanism to start to challenge people to think about the question they're trying to ask.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I think everybody, I know that there were some other questions we didn't get to, but like I said, we want to make sure that we are respectful of your time. Before you jump off, just want to make sure that all of those are aware, if you're interested in furthering your education around data analytics leadership, I want to make you aware that we have an MBA in data analytics leadership, and this program is really ideal for people who are leading data teams or people who are looking to use data more effectively to make better business decisions. Along with that, so you kind of understand our unique focus here on leadership at Lake Forest, we have 100% business leader faculty. You learn from people who know business because they're in business, so people certainly like Chris. All of our courses can be taken in person, they can be taken online, they're designed for working professionals, so we offer flexibility. You can go at your own pace, and you can even take courses via our live video classroom. And lastly, we have a few ways for you to learn more. If you are intrigued and want to get some more information, we're hosting a webinar on October 1st for prospective students specific to information about the courses in the Data Analytics MBA. And then if you're an alum or a current student and want to learn more, we do have a specific webinar for you on the 3rd. Both of these are webinars at noon. They're about 30 minutes. They'll be pretty informal. We hope that you can join us. But we also have an upcoming open house on October 3rd if you want to come and sit in on a class. And then if you want to get the slides for today, you will be receiving an email later today with a link that'll have today's presentation in it. Also, when you log out of today's webinar, there will be a survey form that will provide you an opportunity to RSVP to any of these events I've mentioned. So once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Chris, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Have a great one.